London, 2002. Britain was on edge, its attention fixed on the global war on terror and the threat of attacks on home soil. But inside the walls of Scotland Yard, another kind of war was unfolding. It wasn't against foreign enemies or shadowy extremists. It was against corruption within the very institution sworn to protect the public. A secret report, codenamed Operation Tiberius, painted a chilling picture. Organized crime groups weren't just bribing officers for favors. They were embedding themselves deep inside the Metropolitan Police. The report warned that criminal networks had successfully recruited serving detectives, manipulated court cases, and even sabotaged murder inquiries. How do you fight crime when the police themselves are part of it? How do you restore trust when the line between law and lawlessness has blurred? Operation Tiberius wasn't just an investigation. It was an alarm bell for a nation that believed its justice system was untouchable. By the late 1990s, London was facing a very different kind of crime problem. It wasn't just street-level drug dealing or petty theft. Organized crime groups were becoming wealthier, more connected, and more ruthless. These networks weren't hiding in the shadows anymore. They were moving into property deals, construction projects, and financial schemes that gave them both influence and legitimacy. Their power stretched from the back streets of East London to boardrooms and political circles. At the same time, detectives began to notice something far more disturbing. Investigations into murders, drug trafficking, and violent assaults were collapsing under strange circumstances. Witnesses were suddenly unwilling to testify. Evidence disappeared. Cases that seemed strong in the beginning ended in acquittals. It raised a dangerous question. Were the police being outsmarted, or were they being undermined from the inside? Concerns about corruption weren't new. Earlier probes, like Operation Russell, had already revealed disturbing links between criminal groups and serving officers. These inquiries showed how bribes, intimidation, and social connections could turn policemen into informants or protectors of organized crime. But those operations only scratched the surface. What they hinted at was a much larger, systemic problem. By 2001, the sense of unease was impossible to ignore. Detectives within Scotland Yard knew that certain crime families were operating almost with impunity. They had influence not only over junior officers, but also over more senior figures with the power to shape entire investigations. The fear was simple, but devastating. Criminals had become untouchable because they had their own allies inside law enforcement. This climate of suspicion set the stage for Operation Tiberius. The report was not meant to be a public document. It was intended as an internal assessment, a brutally honest look at how deeply corruption might have infected the system. But what it uncovered would go far beyond isolated cases of misconduct. It pointed to something much darker, a culture where organized crime and police officers were no longer on opposite sides of the law. Instead, in too many cases, they appeared to be working together. Operation Tiberius was born out of necessity. Without it, the question of how far corruption had spread might never have been answered. With it, the scale of the problem would prove more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Operation Tiberius began as an internal inquiry, launched quietly by the Metropolitan Police in 2002. It was never intended for public release. Its purpose was to confront suspicions that had grown too loud to ignore, that organized crime had penetrated the very institution meant to stop it. The report would not focus on petty misconduct or minor bribes. It was tasked with identifying whether entire criminal groups had managed to embed themselves within the force, shaping the outcome of investigations from the inside. What the inquiry found was staggering. Instead of isolated cases of corruption, it uncovered a pattern of systematic infiltration. The report detailed how major crime syndicates had cultivated relationships with serving officers, offering cash, gifts, or favors in exchange for loyalty. Some officers provided tip-offs about upcoming raids. Others interfered with investigations, ensuring that vital evidence was lost, contaminated, or never reached the courtroom. In some cases, prosecutions collapsed because witnesses mysteriously changed their stories or withdrew altogether. One of the most alarming findings was the role of Freemasonry. The report suggested that criminal groups deliberately targeted Masonic lodges as fertile ground for recruitment. Membership in these secretive circles created bonds of trust that criminals could exploit, giving them access to police officers who were more willing to protect their brothers than uphold the law. These connections blurred professional lines and allowed organized crime to spread its influence further than anyone had previously admitted. The mechanics of corruption were both simple and devastating. Officers received bribes in cash or in kind, luxury goods, expensive holidays, or promises of long-term financial gain. In return, they acted as shields for their criminal contacts. Some obstructed investigations by misfiling documents or failing to act on intelligence. Others ensured that jury members were compromised, either through intimidation or financial incentive. The effect was the same. Dangerous criminals walked free, and the justice system appeared powerless to stop them. Operation Tiberius also highlighted the chilling concept of get-out-of-jail-free cards. Certain high-ranking crime figures seemed immune from prosecution, not because they were innocent, but because they enjoyed protection from within the police force. Every time a case was built against them, it fell apart under suspicious circumstances. This created a sense of invincibility among these networks, emboldening them to expand their operations with little fear of consequences. What made Operation Tiberius truly explosive was not just the scale of the corruption it described, but the way it challenged public trust. The report concluded that organized crime had reached the highest levels of the Met. For the ordinary citizen, this meant the police were no longer just failing to keep communities safe. They were actively enabling the criminals they were supposed to fight. It was a revelation that struck at the heart of Britain's justice system, raising questions that no official wanted to answer. The findings were never meant to see the light of day. But once glimpses of the report became public, it was clear why senior figures had been desperate to keep it hidden. Operation Tiberius didn't simply expose misconduct. It revealed a crisis so deep, it threatened the very foundation of law and order in London. Operation Tiberius was shocking, not only for what it revealed about organized crime, but for the sheer number of police officers implicated. The report identified 19 former and 42 serving officers as being linked in some way to corruption. These weren't just minor figures. They included detectives and senior officers whose positions gave them direct influence over major investigations. For a force that prided itself on discipline and tradition, these numbers exposed a crisis of trust at its very core. The methods of corruption were often sophisticated, but always effective. One of the most disturbing allegations was that jurors themselves were being bought off. Trials that should have been open and shut cases ended with inexplicable acquittals. Defendants walked free despite overwhelming evidence. The suspicion was clear. Money and intimidation were making their way into the jury box, destroying the fairness of the justice system before verdicts were ever delivered. Interference didn't stop at the courtroom door. The report suggested that organized crime groups used corrupt officers to disrupt investigations carried out by other forces. Intelligence was leaked, raids were compromised, and surveillance operations were exposed before they had the chance to succeed. In effect, the criminals had eyes and ears inside law enforcement, ensuring that any attempt to bring them down was doomed to fail. For the public, none of this was visible. Ordinary Londoners saw headlines about gangland murders, drug empires, and high-profile arrests. What they couldn't see was how these stories often ended, not with convictions, but with sudden collapses in court or cases quietly dropped without explanation. To most people, it looked as though the criminals were simply untouchable. Few realized the uncomfortable truth. They were being protected from within. This created a devastating contrast between public trust and hidden reality. On the surface, the Metropolitan Police was still one of the most respected forces in the world, seen as professional and resilient in the face of mounting crime. Behind closed doors, however, Operation Tiberius showed that its foundations were being eaten away from the inside. The idea that more than 60 officers, past and present, were linked to organized crime wasn't just embarrassing, it was catastrophic. The implications were clear and frightening. If jurors could be corrupted, if cases could be sabotaged, and if officers could be bought, then the law itself was no longer a guarantee of justice. For London, it meant that the very people sworn to protect the city were, in too many cases, working for its enemies. To understand the true weight of Operation Tiberius, you have to understand the man who came to symbolize it, David Hunt, better known as the Long Fella. Born in Canning Town into a working-class family with 13 children, Hunt grew up in one of the most deprived areas of East London. It was a community known for resilience, but also for poverty, violence, and a strong underworld presence. From an early age, Hunt learned the value of family loyalty and toughness. He wasn't a small-time street criminal for long. By the 1980s, he had built the foundations of what became known as the Hunt Syndicate, an organized crime network that would grow into one of the most feared in Britain. The Hunt Syndicate operated across drugs, extortion, and property scams. But what made them truly dangerous was the combination of discipline and brutality. Unlike some rival gangs who drew attention with flashy lifestyles, Hunt's organization worked quietly, methodically, and with ruthless efficiency. Police reports linked the group to violence that left victims terrified to testify. Yet, time and again, Hunt himself avoided conviction. That was the most striking part of his rise. Despite being investigated for murder, drug trafficking, and fraud, Hunt rarely faced the inside of a prison cell. Cases against him collapsed under suspicious circumstances, echoing the very patterns Operation Tiberius would later expose. Witnesses retracted statements, evidence was ruled inadmissible, and juries delivered acquittals that baffled investigators. The question was always the same. Was Hunt simply clever enough to outwit the system, or was the system protecting him? Hunt's reputation wasn't built on his criminal portfolio alone. It was reinforced by the company he kept. He was known to have connections with notorious figures like Reggie Kray, one half of the infamous Kray twins who had ruled London's underworld in the 1960s. That link gave Hunt a certain credibility in the criminal world, a signal that he was not only powerful, but recognized by legends of Britain's gangster history. But Hunt's power extended beyond the streets. His ability to silence critics showed just how far his influence reached. When investigative journalists tried to shine a light on his empire, they often found themselves under direct threat. Reporters were followed, intimidated, and in some cases dragged into costly legal battles. One of the most high-profile clashes came with journalist Michael Gillard, whose reporting on Hunt led to a libel case. Hunt initially won, forcing the Sunday Times to pay damages. But years later, Gillard's persistence in court overturned the verdict, finally confirming Hunt's role as a crime boss. For the public, this legal struggle revealed what the police had failed to prove for decades: that David Hunt was not just a businessman or a family man, as he liked to portray himself. He was the head of one of Britain's most dangerous criminal syndicates, shielded by corruption and fear. The fact that it took a journalist, not Scotland Yard, to establish this truth was a damning reflection on the state of law enforcement. By the early 2000s, Hunt's empire stretched across London, reaching into legitimate businesses and property deals. He was no longer simply a gangster from Canning Town. He was a symbol of how organized crime could infiltrate every level of society, all while staying out of prison. And when Operation Tiberius quietly documented the scale of police corruption, it was no coincidence that Hunt's name appeared in its pages. When Operation Tiberius was quietly compiled in 2002, its findings were never meant for public eyes. It was an internal document, a confidential review of how organized crime had penetrated London's police force. Yet buried in its pages was a name that stood out immediately: David Hunt, the Long Fella, already known in the underworld as a ruthless crime boss, was identified as a beneficiary of police corruption. It was a revelation that explained what many had suspected for years. Time after time, investigations into Hunt had collapsed. The report made clear why. Corrupt officers weren't just turning a blind eye to his empire. Some were actively protecting him, passing on information about planned raids, tipping off associates, and sabotaging cases before they could reach court. In effect, the very people tasked with dismantling crime networks were ensuring one of Britain's most dangerous syndicates remained untouchable. The files included disturbing examples. In one case, police targeted a scrapyard linked to Hunt, believing it was being used as cover for handling stolen goods. On paper, the raid should have been straightforward. Instead, word of the operation leaked before officers arrived. When they reached the site, key evidence had vanished, and potential suspects had already disappeared. The entire case collapsed, leaving investigators baffled and powerless. Another example involved stolen luxury goods. Detectives had traced items back to Hunt's circle, but just as the case was gathering strength, witnesses pulled out, and crucial leads went cold. Once again, the trail went nowhere. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Whenever Hunt's empire came under scrutiny, the investigation would unravel in ways that defied coincidence. The report stopped short of naming every officer involved, but the implication was chilling. Organized crime had found friends inside the Metropolitan Police, and David Hunt was among those reaping the rewards. This was more than luck or clever lawyering. It was a system where intimidation, bribery, and betrayal of duty allowed the Hunt syndicate to thrive, while honest detectives were left chasing shadows. For Hunt, the effect was devastatingly effective. Each failed case reinforced his reputation as untouchable, fueling fear among rivals and silence among victims. For the public, it revealed something far darker, that the line between law enforcement and lawbreaking was not as clear as they believed. And for Operation Tiberius, it became a symbol of how corruption could shield a crime boss from accountability, even when his crimes were hiding in plain sight. In a world where police investigations crumbled and cases collapsed, one man chose a different path. Michael Gillard, an investigative journalist, refused to be silenced by fear or intimidation. While officers were compromised and witnesses vanished, Gillard put pen to paper and exposed the Hunt syndicate for what it was: a powerful, violent network operating with apparent impunity. His reporting went further than many detectives ever managed. With persistence and detail, Gillard revealed the scale of David Hunt's influence and the fear he spread across East London. But taking on a figure like Hunt came at a cost. It meant legal battles, personal threats, and a fight against a system that often seemed more interested in protecting reputations than uncovering the truth. One of the most defining moments came with the libel case against the Sunday Times, the paper that had dared to publish Gillard's revelations. Hunt claimed he had been falsely accused of leading a criminal empire. The stakes were high. If Hunt won, the truth would be buried, and journalism itself would be discredited. If Gillard and his editors prevailed, the world would see, in court, the weight of evidence against one of Britain's most feared crime bosses. The trial became a clash between silence and exposure, between the shadows of organized crime and the glare of public accountability. In 2013, the High Court delivered its verdict. The Sunday Times had acted responsibly in publishing its investigation. Hunt's libel claim collapsed. For Gillard, it was vindication not just of his work, but of journalism's essential role in a democracy. This victory revealed a striking irony. Where law enforcement had failed for decades, a journalist had succeeded. Gillard had achieved what no police inquiry had managed: to publicly establish David Hunt as a serious, organized crime figure. It was proof that the pen, wielded with courage and truth, could cut deeper than any corrupted system of power. When London won the bid to host the 2012 Olympic Games, the city celebrated a moment of national pride. Billions were promised for investment, jobs, and regeneration. But behind the flags, fireworks, and official speeches, another world was waiting to seize its chance. For organized crime groups, the Olympics were not just a sporting event. They were a gold mine. Entire districts of East London were transformed in preparation for the Games. Old factories were demolished, new housing schemes appeared, and the government poured vast sums of money into redevelopment. For legitimate businesses, it was opportunity. For crime syndicates, it was infiltration. Reports later revealed how figures from the underworld, including the Hunt Syndicate, positioned themselves to profit from land deals, construction contracts, and property speculation around Stratford and the Olympic Park. The Olympic dream also created a smokescreen. Under the banner of national celebration, there was less appetite to ask hard questions. Investigations into organized crime were often slowed down or quietly set aside. Politicians pushed the narrative of unity and progress, while law enforcement agencies faced growing accusations of selective blindness. Whispers suggested that some criminal networks had secured inside information and used it to outmaneuver both competitors and regulators. This was more than opportunism. It was a test of how deeply corruption had embedded itself into Britain's institutions. Publicly, the games were hailed as a triumph of planning and security. Privately, journalists and investigators painted a different picture, a once-in-a-lifetime regeneration project that doubled as a once-in-a-lifetime payday for certain gangs. And just as Operation Tiberius had warned, when politics, money, and police corruption collided, the lines between crime and authority blurred until they were almost impossible to separate. For years, David Hunt carried an aura that few criminals in Britain could match. He wasn't just feared on the streets of East London, he was seen as untouchable. The narrative was simple but chilling. Hunt was too big to bring down. Time and again, cases against him collapsed. Witnesses disappeared, evidence was tampered with, and officers themselves were suspected of protecting his interests. It created the impression that the law could never catch him, no matter how brazen his crimes became. One story in particular cemented his reputation. It was said that Hunt had placed a contract worth £1 million to have police officers killed. Whether rumor or reality, the mere existence of such claims added to his legend. If true, it was a sign of just how dangerous and deeply connected he was. If false, it still worked in his favor, feeding the myth that he was a man beyond reach, a figure so feared that even the suggestion of crossing him came with deadly consequences. What makes the Hunt story so striking is not just his violence, but his ability to profit while under constant suspicion. As investigations faltered, his wealth grew. Businesses flourished, properties expanded, and influence stretched far beyond Canning Town. While others in his circle ended up behind bars, Hunt's name carried on as a symbol of invincibility. The irony is hard to ignore. In a country that prided itself on law and order, one man managed to build a fortune in plain sight while brushing off decades of suspicion. That wasn't just power, it was the creation of a myth, and for years it worked. Operation Tiberius was more than just a report. It became a symbol of something far darker. Its pages exposed how organized crime had seeped into the very heart of law enforcement, showing that corruption wasn't a handful of bad apples, but a systemic problem. The findings painted a picture of a Britain where justice could be bought, where the rule of law bent under the weight of money and influence. The legacy of Tiberius is haunting because it forced the country to face an uncomfortable truth. If criminals could pay their way into the corridors of Scotland Yard, what hope was there for ordinary citizens who trusted the system to protect them? It shattered illusions, replacing the image of an untouchable police force with one tainted by deals made in back rooms and evidence swept under the rug. Even today, the shadow of Operation Tiberius lingers. It serves as a warning that corruption is never fully buried. It waits, festering, ready to resurface. And it leaves us with one unforgettable question, a thought that chills as much now as it did then. If organized crime could buy Scotland Yard, what else could it buy?